The phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling me out of a half-hearted attempt to study. Ryan's name flashed on the screen, and I picked up, already dreading whatever favor he was about to ask. "Hey, Luca," he started, way too chipper for a Tuesday. "I found you a new roommate." My heart sank. My current roommate, Alex, had just dropped the bombshell that he was moving out in 2 weeks. I'd been stressing over finding someone else to split the rent with, but I wasn't sure I was ready for whatever solution Ryan had conjured up. "Who is it?" I asked cautiously. There was a pause, a long one. "Steven," he finally said. I nearly dropped the phone. "Steven? As in your best friend, Steven? The one who lives to party and doesn't know how to shut up? That's Steven?" "Yeah, that's Steven," Ryan replied, his tone now a little more serious. "He needs a place to stay for a couple of months, and you need a roommate. It's perfect." "Perfect," I scoffed. "He's impossible to live with, Ryan. The guy's a walking disaster." Ryan sighed. "Come on, Luca, just meet with him. Talk it over. I wouldn't suggest this if I didn't think it could work." I hesitated. Steven was a lot. Loud, unpredictable, and with a reputation that made me cringe just thinking about it. But with Alex leaving, my options were slim. "Fine," I said, relenting. "I'll meet him for coffee tomorrow, but I'm not." "Great," Ryan said, clearly relieved. "You'll see. It'll be fine." After hanging up, I stared at my textbook, but the words blurred together. Steven freaking Scott, my new potential roommate. What could possibly go wrong? The next day, I walked into the coffee shop 10 minutes early, hoping to gather my thoughts before Steven arrived. The place was buzzing with chatter and the smell of freshly brewed coffee, but my nerves had killed any appetite. I picked a booth in the back, trying to stay out of the way, and ordered a black coffee. Simple, like I needed this conversation to be. I barely had time to take a sip before the door swung open, and there he was. Steven, larger than life as always. He strolled in like he owned the place, guitar slung over his shoulder, dressed head to toe in black. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on me, and then he flashed that trademark grin, the one that made people forget why they were mad at him in the first place. "Luca," he called out, making heads turn. He sauntered over, sliding into the booth across from me without waiting for an invitation. "Been a while, huh?" "Yeah, it has," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Up close, he was even more intimidating. Tall, lean, with those deep brown eyes that always seemed to be laughing at some inside joke. It didn't help that he smelled like a mix of leather and something else, something that made my brain short-circuit for a second. "So you need a roommate," he said, cutting right to the chase. "And I need a place to crash for a bit. Sounds like a win-win to me." "Maybe," I said, playing it cool, "but you've got a reputation, Steven. I don't do loud parties, random people showing up at all hours, or messes everywhere. I'm serious about this. If you're staying, you've got to respect my space." He leaned back, studying me with a smirk that made my skin tingle. "You've got nothing to worry about, man. I'm not as wild as people think. Besides, I'm barely going to be around, just a place to sleep between gigs. You won't even know I'm there." I wasn't convinced, but I couldn't deny there was something about the way he said it that made me want to believe him. "I don't know, Steven. I'm not sure this is a good idea." "Look," he said, leaning forward now, his voice dropping a notch. "I get it. You've heard stories, seen me at my worst, but I promise I can keep it low-key. I just need a place for a couple of months until things settle down." I hesitated, weighing my options. It wasn't like I had a line of people ready to move in, and honestly, finding someone I didn't already know came with its own risks. At least with Steven, I knew what I was getting into, or thought I did. "All right," I finally said, the word feeling heavy on my tongue. "We can try it out. But if it doesn't work, we call it quits. No hard feelings." Steven's grin widened, and for a split second, I wondered if I'd just made a huge mistake. "Deal," he said, holding out his hand. We shook on it, and just like that, my life got a whole lot more complicated. The next morning, I was woken up by the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. Groggy, I reached over and squinted at the screen. "Steven," I answered, still half asleep. "Morning, Luca." Steven's voice was annoyingly chipper for such an early hour. "I'm on my way over with my stuff. Hope you're ready for me." I sat up, my heart doing a weird flip. Yeah, I'll be ready. See you in a bit." I hung up and stared at the ceiling, trying to shake the fog from my brain. It was really happening. Steven was moving in. No turning back now. By the time he pulled up in front of the apartment, I had managed to get dressed and make some coffee. I opened the door to find him standing there with a couple of duffel bags slung over his shoulders, his guitar case in one hand, and a cocky grin on his face. "Looks like you've packed light," I said, eyeing the bags. He shrugged, stepping inside. "I don't need much, just the essentials." "Right," I muttered, closing the door behind him. "Your room's down the hall on the left. Sheets and towels are in the closet if you need them." Stephen nodded and headed down the hallway, the sound of his boots on the hardwood floor echoing in the small space. I followed, feeling a bit like a host trying to impress a guest, even though this was supposed to be my apartment. When he reached his room, he dropped the bags on the bed and turned to me. "Thanks, man. I know this is probably not what you had in mind, but I appreciate you letting me crash here." "Don't mention it," I replied, trying to keep it casual. "Just keep it cool, all right? I've got a lot on my plate with school and work." "Cool as a cucumber," Stephen said with a wink that made my stomach twist in a way I didn't want to think about. "So, what's the plan? You need help with anything around here?" I blinked, not expecting the offer. No, I'm good. Just settle in, I guess. I've got some studying to do, so I'll be in my room." "Got it. I'll stay out of your hair." He flashed another grin before turning back to unpack his things. I retreated to my room, closing the door behind me and leaning against it. The reality of the situation hit me all at once. Stephen was really here just down the hall, and I wasn't sure how I felt about it. Part of me was on edge, waiting for the chaos to start. But another part, a part I wasn't ready to deal with yet, was weirdly excited. I shook my head, trying to focus. I had assignments to finish, deadlines to meet. But as I sat down at my desk, I couldn't stop thinking about the guy unpacking in the next room. A few days after Stephen moved in, things were surprisingly normal, or at least as normal as they could be with him around. He kept to himself mostly, as promised, disappearing for band rehearsals or gigs and coming back late, but always quietly. We didn't interact much, just the occasional hey in the hallway or a quick chat in the kitchen. It was almost too easy, and that made me nervous. One night, I was in the kitchen making dinner, something simple like pasta, when Stephen strolled in, barefoot and shirtless, his damp hair tied back, fresh out of the shower. I nearly dropped the pot of boiling water. "Smells good," he said, leaning against the counter, completely at ease. "Didn't know you could cook." "It's just pasta," I muttered, focusing way too hard on stirring the sauce. "Nothing fancy. Still better than what I'd make," he replied with a grin, eyeing the food. "Mind if I join you?" "Sure if you want," I said, trying to sound casual, though my heart was pounding. I grabbed another plate, setting it down beside mine. Stephen grabbed a fork from the drawer and slid onto a stool at the counter, watching me as I served the food. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller, his presence filling the space in a way I hadn't expected. We ate in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the clinking of utensils against plates. I kept my eyes on my food, but I could feel him watching me, that same smirk playing on his lips. "So, how's school going?" he asked, breaking the silence. "It's fine," I replied, keeping it short. "Busy, but fine." "Yeah, what are you studying again?" "Engineering," I said, glancing up at him. "It's a lot of math and problem solving." He nodded, chewing thoughtfully. "Sounds intense. You must be pretty smart." I shrugged, feeling awkward under his gaze. "I guess." Stephen chuckled, setting his fork down. "You're too modest, man. I've seen your setup, books everywhere, notes all over the place. You're killing it, aren't you?" "Trying to," I admitted, feeling a blush creep up my neck. "It's just a lot sometimes." "Yeah, I get that," he said, his voice softer now. "Music's the same way. Everyone thinks it's all fun, games, but there's a lot of work behind the scenes." I looked at him, surprised. It was the first time he'd said anything remotely serious since moving in. "I didn't know you felt that way about it." "Most people don't," he said with a small smile. "But I love it, just like you probably love what you do, right?" "Yeah," I admitted, "I do." We locked eyes then, and for a moment, the air between us shifted, something unspoken passing between us. It was different from the usual banter, more intimate. I felt a tug in my chest, something pulling me toward him, and I wasn't sure what to do with it. Before I could think too much, Stephen broke the spell, standing up and stretching, muscles rippling under his skin. "Thanks for dinner, Luca. I owe you one." "Don't worry about it," I said quickly, looking away as he grabbed his plate. As he walked out, he paused at the doorway, glancing back with a smile that sent a jolt through me. You're not what I expected. In a good way. With that, he was gone, leaving me standing in the kitchen, the tension from before still crackling in the air. I let out a breath. I didn't realize I'd been holding my mind spinning. This was getting complicated, way more complicated than I'd anticipated, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for what might happen next. The next couple of weeks passed in a blur of routine, school, work, and the occasional shared meal with Stephen. Despite the undercurrent of tension, things were going smoothly, almost too smoothly. I started to let my guard down, thinking maybe, just maybe, we could make this work without any drama. But then came Friday night. I had just settled in on the couch with a book, enjoying the rare quiet evening, when the front door burst open. Stephen walked in, laughing loudly with two guys and a girl trailing behind him. They were all carrying beer and looked like they were ready to party. "Hey, Luca," Stephen called out, not noticing, or not caring, about the startled look on my face. "We're just going to hang out for a bit. Hope that's cool." Before I could respond, they'd already taken over the living room, music blaring from someone's phone, the smell of alcohol filling the air. My book was forgotten as I watched them, irritation bubbling up inside me. "Stephen, can we talk for a sec?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He glanced over, still grinning. "Sure, what's up?" I gestured towards the hallway, and he followed me into the kitchen, out of earshot from his friends. The second the door swung shut behind us, I turned on him. "What the hell, Stephen? We talked about this. No random parties, no noise. I've got a ton of work to do, and this is the last thing I need right now." His grin faded, replaced by a look of mild confusion. "It's just a few friends, Luca. We're not throwing a rager or anything. We'll keep it down, I promise." "That's not the point," I snapped, frustration creeping into my voice. "You said you'd respect my space, but this isn't it. I need quiet to focus, and this isn't working for me." Stephen's expression shifted, his easygoing demeanor slipping just a bit. "All right, I get it. I'm sorry. I'll tell them to keep it down, or maybe we'll head out somewhere else." I exhaled, some of the tension easing, but not all of it. "That would be great. I just need some peace, okay? I've got a big project due next week, and I can't afford any distractions." He nodded, looking more serious than I'd ever seen him. "Yeah, of course. I didn't mean to mess up your night. I'll take care of it." True to his word, Stephen walked back into the living room and told his friends they needed to leave. There were a few groans of protest, but he didn't back down, and within minutes, the apartment was quiet again. He didn't say anything as he came back into the kitchen, just gave me a small nod before retreating to his room. I stood there feeling a mix of relief and guilt. He'd handled it better than I expected, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. I'd drawn a line, and while he respected it, the easygoing camaraderie we'd been building felt like it had taken a hit. I went back to the couch, trying to get back into my book, but my mind kept wandering. This was exactly what I'd been worried about, our different lifestyles clashing. I just hoped it wasn't the start of something worse. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, still feeling the residue of last night's tension. As I shuffled into the kitchen, I was surprised to find Stephen already there, sitting at the table with a mug of coffee in hand. He looked up as I entered, a sheepish smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Morning," he said, his voice softer than usual. "First in the morning," I replied, grabbing a mug and pouring myself some coffee. I hesitated for a moment before sitting down across from him. The silence between us was heavy, filled with the unspoken words from the night before. Stephen broke the silence first. "I'm really sorry about last night, Luca. I didn't think it through." I took a sip of my coffee, mulling over his words. He sounded sincere, which wasn't something I'd expected from him. "It's okay," I said finally, meeting his gaze. "I just need things to stay manageable around here. I've got a lot on my plate, and I'm not great with surprises." "Yeah, I get that," he said, nodding. "I'll try to keep things low-key from now on. I don't want to mess up what we've got going here." There was something in the way he said it, something that made me realize how much he actually cared about making this work. It caught me off guard. Stephen was supposed to be the carefree one, the guy who didn't take anything seriously. But here he was, genuinely trying to keep the peace. "Thanks," I said, the tension in my shoulders easing a little. "I appreciate that." He flashed me a grin, one that seemed more genuine, less guarded than before. "No problem. Besides, I like hanging out with you. It's different." "Different how?" I asked, curious despite myself. He shrugged, leaning back in his chair. "I don't know. Most of the people I hang out with are all about partying, having a good time. But you're different. You actually give a shit about things, and that's kinda cool. I wasn't sure how to respond to that, so I just nodded, feeling an odd warmth spread through my chest. We fell into a more comfortable silence, sipping our coffee. For the first time since he moved in, it felt like we were on the same page, like maybe we could actually be friends. Just as I was starting to relax, Stephen spoke again, his tone more serious. Look, I know I've got a reputation, and I know you're probably wondering why I'm crashing here instead of with one of my buddies. I hadn't wanted to ask, but now that he brought it up, I couldn't help but be curious. Yeah, I've been wondering. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. The truth is, I'm trying to get my shit together. The band's taking off and I need to be focused, not partying all the time. But that's hard to do when you're surrounded by people who only see you as the life of the party, you know? I nodded slowly, starting to understand a side of Stephen I hadn't seen before. So, you're here because you want to keep things low-key. Focus on your music. Exactly, he said, his gaze meeting mine. I know I'm not perfect and I've screwed up plenty, but I'm serious about making this work. Not just with the band, but here too. Something about the way he said, it made me believe him. It wasn't just talk, he really meant it. I can respect that, I said, feeling a strange sense of connection with him. If you're serious, then I'll do what I can to help. His eyes softened, and for a moment, the distance between us seemed to shrink. Thanks, Luca. That means a lot. We sat there in companionable silence, the morning light filtering through the kitchen window. It wasn't the awkwardness I'd expected. It was something more comfortable, almost easy. And as much as I didn't want to admit it, I liked this side of Stephen. Maybe things were starting to change, and maybe that wasn't such a bad thing after all. A few more weeks passed, and life with Stephen had settled into a comfortable rhythm. We'd found our groove, me with my studies and work, and him with his music and late-night rehearsals. The tension that had marked the early days of our arrangement had eased, replaced by a growing camaraderie. But there was always that undercurrent, that something between us that neither of us acknowledged, but both of us felt. One night, after a particularly grueling day of classes, I came home to find Stephen sprawled out on the couch, strumming his guitar. The soft notes filled the apartment, calming the frayed edges of my nerves. He glanced up as I walked in, giving me a small smile. "Brief day," he asked, his fingers never missing a beat. "You have no idea," I muttered, dropping my bag by the door and collapsing into the armchair across from him. I swear, if I have to look at one more differential equation, my brain's going to melt. Stephen chuckled, setting his guitar aside. "Sounds brutal. You need a drink?" "God, yes," I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "But I don't think I can handle anything stronger than water right now." He grinned and got up, disappearing into the kitchen. A moment later, he returned with a beer for himself and a glass of water for me. "Here you go, Mr. Responsible." "Thanks," I said, taking the glass and downing half of it in one go. "What about you? How was rehearsal?" He shrugged, taking a swig of his beer. Same old, same old. We're working on a new track, but it's not coming together like we want it to. Frustrating as hell. Creative blocks suck," I commiserated, leaning back in the chair. "But you'll figure it out. You always do." He smiled at that, a genuine one that made my chest tighten in a way I didn't want to analyze. "Thanks, man. I hope you're right." For a while, we just sat there, the comfortable silence between us only broken by the occasional sip of beer or water. It was one of those rare, quiet moments that I'd come to appreciate with Stephen. No pressure, no expectations, just two people sharing. But then he shifted, turning to face me more directly, and the air between us changed. His eyes met mine, more intense than usual, and something passed between us, something electric. Before I could second-guess it, Stephen spoke, his voice lower, more serious. "Luca," he started, the word hanging in the air like a question. "Yeah," I replied, my voice coming out a little rougher than I intended. "I've been thinking," he said, leaning forward slightly, "about us, about this thing between us." My heart skipped a beat, and I suddenly felt like the room had gotten 10 degrees warmer. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I knew. Set his beer down on the coffee table, leaning in closer, where his gaze never leaving mine. "I mean this," his hand reached out, brushing against mine where it rested on the arm of the chair. The touch was light, tentative, but it sent a jolt through me all the same. I didn't pull away. Instead, I found myself leaning in too, the distance between us shrinking. My heart was pounding, but I couldn't look away from him, couldn't stop myself from closing that final inch. When our lips met, it was like everything else fell away. The day's stress, the lingering doubts, all of it. There was just the warmth of his mouth against mine, the taste of beer on his lips, the feeling of his hand sliding up to cup the back of my neck. I kissed him back, not thinking, just feeling. And for a few moments, it was perfect. But then reality crashed in, and I pulled back, my breath coming in short gasps. "Stephen, we can't," I started, but the words caught in my throat. "I know," he said, his voice hoarse, his eyes dark with something I couldn't quite name. "But I don't want to stop." Neither did I, but this was dangerous territory. Living together, working together. It was all too much, too risky. But as I looked at him, his face inches from mine, I realized I didn't want to go back to pretending this wasn't happening. "Then we don't," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "But we need to be careful. We can't let this mess everything up." He nodded, his hand still resting on my arm, a spark of something more in his eyes. "Agreed. No drama, no bullshit, just us figuring this out." "Okay," I said, the word barely more than a whisper. We sat there for a moment longer, the tension between us now something tangible, almost alive. I knew this was crossing a line we could never uncross, but in that moment, I didn't care. I wanted this, wanted him, and whatever came next, we'd fix. The next morning, the reality of what had happened between us set in like a fog. I woke up earlier than usual, the weight of the previous night pressing down on my chest. Stephen's door was still closed, and I wasn't sure if I was relieved or disappointed that I didn't have to face him just yet. I moved through my morning routine on autopilot, shower, breakfast, coffee, but my mind kept replaying that kiss, the way his hand had felt on my neck, the look in his eyes when he pulled me closer. It had been everything I wanted and everything I feared. I was staring blankly at my textbook when I heard his door creak open. My heart raced as I waited for him to appear. When he finally did, he looked normal, too normal, like nothing had happened. He caught my eye and gave me a small, tentative smile. "Morning," he said, his voice casual, but I could hear the uncertainty underneath. "For morning," I replied, forcing myself to sound the same. We were both trying too hard, and it showed. Stephen walked into the kitchen, grabbing a mug and pouring himself some coffee. He moved with his usual easy confidence, but there was a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. He leaned against the counter, taking a sip and studying me over the rim of his mug. "So, about last night," he started, trailing off as if unsure how to finish. "Yeah," I said, looking down at my notes but not really seeing them. "We probably need to talk about that." "Probably," he agreed, setting his mug down. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, Luca, I don't regret it, but I get if you're freaking out. I didn't mean to complicate things." "It's not that I regret it," I said quickly, finally looking up at him. "It's just, this is new for me, Stephen. And with us living together, I don't want to mess up what we have, you know?" He nodded, his expression serious. "I get that. I don't want to mess things up either, but I don't want to pretend nothing happened." "Me neither," I admitted, feeling a knot of tension ease slightly. "But we need to be careful. We can't let this get out of hand." He smiled at that, a hint of his usual swagger returning. "Careful, right? That's not really my style." I couldn't help but smile back, even as nerves twisted in my stomach. "Yeah, I know, but this is important, Stephen. We can't just jump into this without thinking it through." "I know," he said, his voice softer now. He pushed off the counter and walked over to where I was sitting, leaning down so we were eye level, "but we'll figure it out. Together." His words were reassuring, but the proximity, the way his eyes were locked on mine, sent my thoughts spiraling. There was so much between us now, so much unspoken. But even as the fear of what might happen lingered, I couldn't deny that I wanted this, wanted him. Before I could overthink it, I nodded. "Yeah, together." For a moment, we just stood there, the tension from last night still crackling between us. But this time, it wasn't just about the fear of what might happen, it was about the possibility of what could be. He straightened up, giving me a playful nudge. "All right, Mr. Serious. I'm going to head out for a bit, clear my head. We'll talk more later." "Yeah," I said, grateful for the breather. "We'll talk later." As he grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, anxiety, anticipation. This was new territory for both of us, and I knew it wouldn't be easy. But as I watched him leave, I realized I was willing to take the risk. Whatever happened next, we'd face it together. And that thought, as scary as it was, made the whole thing feel a little less daunting. 3 days passed, and things between Stephen and me settled into an uneasy rhythm. We were careful around each other, navigating this new terrain with cautious steps. We talked more, shared more, but the underlying tension, both emotional and physical, never quite went away. It was as if we were waiting for something to break, for the other shoe to drop. And then one Friday night it did. I was sitting at the kitchen table, buried in notes for an upcoming exam, when I heard the front door slam. Stephen walked in, his face flushed with anger, his usual carefree demeanor replaced by something darker. He didn't even glance my way as he tossed his keys onto the counter, his movements sharp and angry. "Stephen, you okay?" I asked, standing up, sensing something was seriously wrong. He didn't answer at first, just paced the length of the kitchen, his hands clenched into fists. Finally, he stopped, turning to face me, his eyes blazing. "No, I'm not okay. We just got dropped from the label." But the words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What? Why?" "Some bullshit about us not fitting their image anymore." He spat, his voice thick with frustration. "We've been working our asses off, and now this. Just like that, it's all gone." I didn't know what to say. This band was everything to Stephen. It was his passion, his future. To have it ripped away like this, I could see it tearing him apart. "Stephen, I'm so sorry," I said, stepping closer, wanting to offer some kind of comfort but unsure how. He shook his head, his jaw tight. "Sorry doesn't fix this, Luca. We were so close. And now it's all falling apart." I reached out, putting a hand on his arm. "You'll figure it out. You always do. This isn't the end." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment, the anger in his eyes softened. But then he pulled away, running a hand through his hair, clearly torn between wanting to lean on me and pushing me away. "I don't know what the hell I'm supposed to do now," he muttered, more to himself than to me. I hesitated, then said, "You're supposed to keep going. This sucks, and it's unfair, but you can't let it break you." He let out a harsh laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Easier said than done, man. You don't get it." "Maybe not," I admitted, stepping closer again. "But I'm here, Stephen. Whatever you need, whatever you want to do next, I'm with you." He stared at me, the conflict playing out in his eyes, anger, frustration, something deeper, something vulnerable. And then, in a move that surprised even me, he grabbed my shoulders and pulled me into a fierce kiss, all desperation and raw emotion. I kissed him back, trying to pour all the reassurance and support I could into it, letting him know without words that I wasn't going anywhere, that I was here and I wasn't going to let him face this alone. When he finally pulled back, his breathing ragged, he rested his forehead against mine. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what I'm doing." "It's okay," I whispered back, my heart pounding. "We'll figure it out. Together." He nodded, but I could feel the weight of his fear and uncertainty pressing down on him. This was a side of Stephen I hadn't seen before. The side that wasn't all bravado and confidence. The side that was just as scared as I was about what came next. "I just need to get out of here," he said, stepping back, his hands trembling slightly. "I need to clear my head." "Do you want me to come with you?" I asked, unsure if he needed space or support. He shook his head, already grabbing his jacket. "No, I need to be alone for a bit. I'll be back later." I watched him leave, the door closing behind him with a finality that made my chest ache. I knew he needed to process this in his own way, but it hurt to see him so lost, so unsure of himself, and it scared me too because I realized just how much I cared about him, how much I needed him to be okay. I sank back into my chair, my mind racing. This was the first real test of whatever it was we were building together, and I had no idea how we were going to get through it. But as I sat there in the silence he'd left behind, I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't giving up on him. Not now, not ever. Stephen didn't come back that night. I stayed up late, the minutes ticking by, my worry growing with every passing hour. I tried to focus on my schoolwork, but my mind kept drifting back to him, where he was, what he was doing, if he was okay. When I finally fell asleep on the couch, it was restless, filled with fragmented dreams of him walking away and never coming back. I was jolted awake by the sound of the front door creaking open. My heart leapt as I sat up, blinking in the dim light. Stephen stood in the doorway, looking exhausted but composed. Relief flooded through me, but I forced myself to stay calm, to not overwhelm him the moment he stepped in. "You're back," I said, my voice rough from sleep. "Yeah," he replied, his tone subdued. "Sorry, I didn't mean to worry you." I shook my head, getting up from the couch. "I was just worried. You didn't answer your phone." "I know," he said, running a hand through his hair. "I just needed to clear my head." think things through. I watched him, trying to read the expression on his face. There was still tension there, but it wasn't as sharp as it had been. And, did you figure things out? He sidestepping further into the room and dropping his jacket on the chair. Sort of. I realized something out there, Luca. Something important. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest. He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine, and what I saw there was something raw, something real. I've been running, from everything, responsibility, commitment, feelings. But this IBS, it's the one thing I don't want to run from. His words hit me like a wave, crashing over all the doubts and fears I'd been holding on to. Stephen, I'm serious, Luca, he continued, stepping closer, his voice steady. I don't know what the hell I'm doing half the time, but I know I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose you. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my emotions in check. You're not going to lose me. But this isn't going to be easy, Stephen. We've got a lot to figure out. I know, he said, nodding. But I'm ready to try. I'm tired of screwing things up, of pushing people away. I want to do this right, with you. For a moment, all I could do was stare at him, his sincerity in his eyes, the vulnerability in his voice. This was the Stephen I'd been glimpsing in small moments, the one who cared deeply, who was capable of more than just playing the role of the carefree rocker, but the one who was scared, just like me, but willing to take the risk. I stepped closer, closing the distance between us. Okay, I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. We'll figure it out together. He let out a breath like he'd been holding it in for too long. Together, he echoed, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. I reached out, taking his hand in mine, and the warmth of his touch sent a wave of reassurance through me. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough to say we were in this, that we were choosing to face whatever came next side by side. Come on, I said, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. Let's sit down and talk. He nodded, following me to the couch. We sat close, our hands still intertwined, and for the first time in a long time I felt a sense of calm, a sense of rightness. As we talked, the weight of the past few weeks started to lift. We made plans, not just for the immediate future, but for what we wanted this relationship to be. It wasn't perfect, and there were no guarantees, but we were both committed to trying, to giving this a real chance. When the conversation finally lulled, Stephen leaned back, his head resting against the couch, his fingers still laced with mine. He said, a hint of his usual playfulness returning. I never thought I'd find myself in this situation, living with my best friend's brother, falling for him, and actually wanting to make it work. I chuckled, shaking my head. Life's funny that way. Yeah, he agreed, turning to look at me, his expression soft, but I wouldn't have it any other way. Neither would I realized. As uncertain as the future was, as scary as this leap we were taking together, I knew that I wanted to see where it led. With Stephen by my side, it didn't seem so daunting after all. And as we sat there, the first light of dawn breaking through the window, I knew we were on the brink of something new, something real. Whatever challenges came our way, we'd face them together, and that was enough.